Before we get started quilting each quilt, I want to talk for a minute about batting and how the batting that you pick for your quilt can really affect the finished quilt. For most of my quilts and the 4 quilts I'll be quilting in this series, I'm actually going to be using polyester felt. I like using polyester felt, and I've been using it more and more because I like the flat finish that it gives to a quilt. It doesn't shrink, it doesn't wave, it's fairly stiff, and it keeps my quilts very flat. But for a beginner, you might want to consider a cotton or a cotton blended batting. These are battings that have mostly cotton fiber and then another fiber mixed in this situation, bamboo. Cotton battings typically have a little bit of a shrink to them, sometimes as little as 3%, but this can affect the surface of your quilt and the finished quilt quite a considerable amount. What happens to a quilt top when you use a cotton batting or a cotton blended batting is that after you wash the quilt, it slightly shrinks up. It ever so slightly shrivels up, and all of your threads over the surface of the quilt get kind of hidden in all those little valleys created by the quilt top. For a beginner, having your threads slightly hide in those little ridges and valleys of the slightly shrunken quilt might help you deal with some of the imperfections that you're maybe freaking out about whenever you see when you're first starting free motion quilting. If you find yourself picking at your stitches constantly, it might be comforting to know that after you wash your quilt, those stitches aren't going to be very noticeable. So a good choice for a beginner would be either 100% cotton batting or one of the new cotton blends. We now have a cotton blended bat with bamboo, a cotton blended bat with soy, and the typical cotton polyester blends as well. These battings have a small amount of shrinkage, which allow your quilt to continue to look beautiful, but give you just a little bit more comfort when it comes to dealing with the slight imperfections of your quilt top. These battings and the new fibers being used in them are really neat because not only do they act a little bit differently when it comes to the drape and the warmth of the quilt, but they also really help to hide those little imperfections and help you not focus on every single mistake on the surface of the quilt. Now, the other thing that you really need to keep in mind whenever you pick a batting is the rating on the batting. Somewhere on the package you're going to see stitch up to and then a number apart. So in this case it's stitch up to 10 inches apart. That means that on this quilt I could literally stitch straight lines every 10 inches, and that would be enough quilting if I use that batting, because the batting is designed to not beard or shift so long as there are stitches within 10 inches of each other. Now, of course, straight lines over the quilt on this quilt would probably look pretty bad, but on some quilts, if you're wanting to finish something really, really quickly, then that might be the way you want to finish it, in which case you want to look for a batting that allows you the most space between those lines, so 10 inches or 12 inches. Some battings have very small space, so quilting only up to 4 inches. That wouldn't be a very good pick if you wanted to leave a large amount of space open. Now, this is the quilt we're going to stitch in the ditch, and you can see here we have quite a lot of space left open in this border. If we were to pick a batting that only allowed quilt stitching up to 4 inches, well, this wouldn't really work because this is an 8-inch gap and that would be too much space. So you want to pay attention to that. A lot of people ask me why I stitch my quilts so densely. It's obviously not needed. It's obviously not necessary for the battings we have now. Well, most of the reason why I stitch the way I do is because it's decoration. I am adding texture, I am adding dimension to the surface of my quilt. So it is by no means necessary to stitch your quilt to death. You can leave areas open, but you need to make sure that your batting can handle the area and the space that you want to leave open. So in this situation, stitching in the ditch, I'm picking a batting that can handle stitching up to 8 inches. Polyester felt is very durable, and I haven't had it shift or beard on me, even with leaving large gaps open. These quilts are not necessarily for show, but they are for demonstration purposes, which is why I'm using the felt. If I was using this for a bed quilt or a crib quilt, something that was going to be cuddled up with and played with and washed a lot, I would probably choose a cotton or a cotton blend. That's just simply the differences between what the quilt is being used for, what its intended purpose is for, and the choices that you make because of that. No matter what batting you choose to use in your quilt, whether it is a cotton blended bat, a 100% cotton bat, a 100% polyester bat, or polyester felt like I'm using in these quilts, whatever you use, first test it in a sample and wash it and see if it's going to finish the way you like. If it's not, you need to find something else that will. You want to test it because you wouldn't want to risk ruining a quilt with a technique that you don't like, with a batting you don't like. I have experimented a considerable amount with thread and fabric and battings, and I have to say the only thing that has ever ruined a quilt top has been a bad batting. The most important thing you can do is invest in a high quality batting. Do not cheap out. Don't go to a big box store and buy a cheap bat. Yes, I'm talking badly about those big box stores because usually the battings carried in those stores are going to be 100% polyester, high loft battings that aren't very high quality, and generally they will beard on the back of your quilt. That's what's called whenever the fibers literally start pulling out through the front and the back of your fabric. And once it starts, there's nothing that can happen to stop it, and it's extremely frustrating. So please invest in your quilts. Don't cheap out when it comes to the batting. Give yourself a good batting because your middle layer of your quilt really does determine quite a bit about the finished product. Don't miss the next video in this quilting series. Please go to freemotionquilting.blogspot.com for the next video.